and thank you for watching DC Statehood Today, the show that keeps you informed on the latest DC statehood issues. I am your host, Denisha Richard. You can watch us online at dctv.org or dc51.us. You can also follow us on Twitter at DC51Today. Actor Jonathan Banks is the 10th celebrity featured in the 51 Stars campaign. The actor is the star of the show Better Call Saul as well as Breaking Bad. Jonathan Banks joins other celebrities who publicly support statehood alongside Senator Stiles on television public service announcements. The goal of the campaign is to gain 51 stars to support DC in becoming the 51st state of the Union. A new app has been created for DC Statehood supporters, appropriately titled DC Statehood. The app can be found on both Android and iPhone app stores, free of charge. The app allows users to view the latest edition of the DC Statehood Today newsletter and shows. The app also provides links to view DC Statehood resources. HR 317 welcomes its 131st co-sponsor, Representative Brendan Boyle. Boyle serves as the Democrat representative of the 13th District of Pennsylvania. Currently, there are no Republicans on the bill, and Representative Franklin Garcia began an initiative to gain Republican co-sponsors of the bill. HR 317 was introduced by Eleanor Holmes Norton to admit D.C. as the 51st state of the Union. Thanks to the district, taxpayers across the nation had 3 extra days to file their taxes. Tax day fell on April 18th instead of the usual 15th this year, but district taxpayers still lack the same rights as citizens in other states. Mayor Bowser honored statehood and voting rights activists at the Full Democracy Champions Breakfast, and DC Vote held a march starting in Freedom Plaza and concluded by joining Democracy Spring and Democracy Awakening on Capitol Hill in protest. Several Republicans in the district also joined in protest on Capitol Hill with the No Vote, No Tax for DC campaign. Senator Michael D. Brown debuted an informational website, teachdemocracy.net. The website educates youth on DC statehood in a multimedia setting. The website includes the viral Last Week Tonight segment on DC statehood with John Oliver. Senator Brown stated that the site is aiming to teach about DC's fight for justice to form a more perfect union. The new Columbia Statehood Commission released a draft constitution on May 6 in favor of statehood. This comes after Mayor Bowser's public announcement to further aid the DC statehood movement to gain wider publicity in order to make DC the 51st state of the Union. When describing the Constitution, Senator Stiles stated, "The 1982 Constitution outlined many aspirational hopes, but did not guarantee us the rights of DC statehood." The new Columbia Statehood Commission has involved the community on the new Constitution, including holding public forums and establishing working groups to gain the public's opinion on the new Constitution. You can view more information about the Constitution on dc51.us and also statehood.dc.gov. Stay tuned for a discussion with DC statehood activists and hear their opinions on the draft Constitution with host Theodore Brown.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of the DC Statehood Today show. I'm Theodora Brown, your host. And in the studio today we have Representative Charles Moreland. Welcome, Representative Moreland. And you had the distinct honor of being the first elected U.S. Representative for the District of Columbia. Welcome, and thank you for starting that effort. So tell us how long you served and what some of the challenges and triumphs that you experienced in your first years of service.
Thank you for having me. I was elected in 1990. I served for 4 years.
Two terms?
Two terms, yes. I was elected at the same time that Jesse Jackson was elected as DC's first United States Senator with Senator Florence Pendleton. The first challenge that we had was a lack of funding, any support. We didn't have an office. In fact, we were shocked that Mayor Kelly at the time had nothing, no intention of offering us anything. We didn't have an office. And so I set up an office myself. utilize my own funds at the
Where'd you
corner
set
of
that
14th and U Street. There's a building diagonal to the Reeve Center. So I set up an office there. And of course we met, had numerous meetings. But we, Jesse, myself and Florence, we launched our own campaign for statehood now. In fact, we got the HR 51 introduced. We met with Eleanor. We had.
Was that in your first or your second term?
It was the second term, 1993. But the first term, of course, we spent working out all the details and nuances of resolving the problems associated with possibly introducing a statehood bill in Congress. Of course, there were a number of people, including some of our friends and allies, who thought that we should never introduce it for various reasons. But our commitment was to have it introduced and debated on whether it passed or not. We thought that was vitally important.
So how much support did you get for HR 51? On both sides of Congress.
Well, of course we had Senator Ted Kennedy that was supporting us, Ron Dellums, who was chair of the committee at the time. I'm not sure how many sponsors we had. Of course it was Eleanor, and we had Mayor Kelly testify, and various members of the council. So we testified in support of the statehood bill.
So what did you do after you left the House, left the seat? What kinds of activities were you involved with regarding statehood?
Well, I continued to publish a newspaper called the New Columbia Times. Continued to meet and try to organize the citizens. My position, and one of the reasons why I left, is I realized that the efforts in the House and the efforts across the United States would not be sufficient. In fact, the members of Congress used to tell me the problem is that the citizens of Washington, D.C. need to stand up and express a just demand. That's what's been missing in this movement. We have begged and pleaded, and it's nice.
But we actually had that happen during the Vincent Gray administration, because there were protests and there were arrests made. So we need something a little bit more than what happened during the Gray administration, you're saying?
Absolutely. In fact, we had more during the Kelly administration. The mayor was arrested. I was arrested. Jesse Jackson was arrested. Eleanor. We had all that. In fact, if you look at some of the headlines of some of the newspapers that we produced, the very same thing we've seen. But what we need is for the citizens of Washington, D.C. to stand up and demand. And I'm not talking about just simple protests of a few people, but we need something pretty much like what happened in the civil rights movement, where there was an attack on all fronts. There were boycotts, there were demonstrations, there was protests. We simply need to look at what happened during the Arab Spring. At some point, the citizens of Washington, D.C. need to stand up and make it known and make it clear that we will not accept an unacceptable system, a system of government that's unacceptable anywhere else in the world. If you took this system of government and tried to impose it on any people anywhere in the world, they would take up arms and shoot you dead, just like the citizens and the fathers of this nation. This is an unacceptable system. Home rule is nothing but a continuation of tyranny and taxation without representation, and it's a continuation of the government's political plantation.
So what do you think about the efforts of the mayor, the commission, is the New Columbia Statehood Commission, this sort of reignited effort to mobilize people across the city to get this referendum, passed, or the voters to vote on the referendum in November, and also the drafting of the new state constitution? Tell me what you think about that.
I think the mayor ought to be commended for her stated support of D.C. statehood. There are many of our citizens who are concerned, especially citizens who've been involved in the statehood movement over the years. They're concerned that some of the efforts and some of the strategies that are going to be employed might delay the bills that are currently in Congress. But my position is that certainly to the extent that the mayor supports statehood, that we ought to all support her In fact, the movement has been reinvigorated. There has been interest created by her efforts. So she ought to be commended for that. But we have to be very careful. First, do no harm. And one of the things I am concerned about is that some of the proponents of this effort are talking about statehood and voting rights. Well, voting rights and statehood are opposed to each other. Voting rights is an incremental approach to freedom. So we shouldn't seek freedom in increments, because you're either free or you're not free. And statehood is the only means by which we can achieve our freedom. In a union of states, anything that is not a state is inferior, and that's why statehood is the only option. To seek voting rights is a distraction, a diversion, and so they need to just strike that from their plans.
Right. On that note, this wonderful conversation with you about statehood and the work that you've done to promote and advance statehood in the District of Columbia. And I thank you so much for coming to join me today, and would love to have you come back and talk more in depth about some particular strategies that we need to employ to get statehood for DC.
And thank you. I'd be very happy to come back at any time.
Great. And thank you for joining us today for the DC Statehood Today show. I'm your host, Theodora Brown.
When I won the championship in Washington, DC residents cheered me on. Now I want to join their fight.
Because DC residents have no voting representation in Congress, for Washington, D.C., it's never a fair fight.
That's wrong. That's why I support statehood for the District of Columbia.
If you think D.C. deserves equal rights, call your senator and tell him to support D.C. statehood.
Give D.C. a fair shot. Join the fight for D.C. statehood.
Hello, I'm Theodora Brown, and welcome to another edition of this DC Statehood Today show. We have in our studio today Ann Loikow, who has been a long time DC resident and political and community activist in DC. Welcome, Ann.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So I know that you're a retired federal government lawyer, but I know that you've been pretty engaged in the political process for many, many years in DC. So tell us about that.
Well, I've been engaged in the political process as long as we've had a political process in modern times, which is basically since the passage of the Home Rule Act. And I was one of the original ANC commissioners who helped create the system back in the 70s.
Right, so you have a lot of history and information to share with us today. So tell us about what you were doing at the very beginning of the Home Rule, the passage of the Home Rule Act, and fast forward and tell us what you're doing now.
Well, at the very beginning, I was involved. I first met Sam Smith, who was the father of the modern statehood movement, who wrote an incredible opinion in 1970 that explained how it was constitutional for us to be a state, drawing on some stuff that Douglas Moore had proposed, and which led to the creation of the Statehood Party. And from that came the initiative in 1979, the approval of the initiative, the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution being drafted, and I helped some of the delegates who were running for that, and the passage of the Constitution in 1982, which was ratified by the people. Since then, every organization I've been with, which is probably every organization in town by this point, we've talked about statehood, we've pushed it. I've also worked on getting other organizations in the districts, everything from the Episcopal Diocese of Washington and the Episcopal General Convention to the National Association of Retired and Active Federal Employees, all the way up through their convention several times in a row, endorsing statehood,
right,
and talking to everybody I could think of to endorse statehood.
Right, so there are a lot of highlights, I'm sure, in your history of statehood activism, but tell us some more recent highlights.
Well, the more recent was just getting the whole process jump-started, going back to November of 2008, where we first started seeing after President Obama's election that if there ever was a time to push statehood and to talk about our rights to the American people, it was now.
And what exactly did you do?
Well, at that time, I got together everybody I could think of across the city who'd worked on statehood for the last 40 years, and we formed a loose coalition we called DC Statehood Yes We Can, and we did, with the help of Senator Brown, Michael Brown, a 51 state effort to put statehood signs on the 51 major streets coming to the district for the inauguration, mobilizing lots of people to go to all the crowds, to all the events, to pass out stuff on statehood, to talk to people, and then organizing to follow that up by reaching out to all kinds of organizations all over the city and getting them all to endorse statehood, whether it was the political ward committees, whether it was the state committee, whether getting all the way up to the Democratic National Committee, whether it was sororities, fraternities, you name it, veterans groups, just reaching out to them and educating them on statehood and getting them to back it.
So what are you working on today?
What I'm working on today is sort of the big push has been since we worked with our delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton 3 Congresses ago to reintroduce a statehood bill. And when she first introduced it in the 2000s, she had no co-sponsors. The second Congress, I think she had 25 starting. The current Congress, she had 93. And all of us as citizens have been working together and going up to lobby on the Hill to get co-sponsors. Right now we have 131 on the House bill, and we have 19, and if you add the Senator Carper, who's the sponsor, 20 senators on the Senate bill.
So you think that's going to make a difference that we have all this high number of co-sponsors on both the
Well, but that's how you get legislation through, is first you have to educate the members that this is something they should care about, and if they care about it enough to put their to actually sign on to the bill and say that they're for it, and then to educate them some more and their constituents to say this is a matter that matters to all Americans, that every American, even the people who live, almost 700,000 of us who live in our national capital, should have the same right to self-government, and you only get that through statehood.
Sure. So now the New Columbia Statehood Commission has sort of reignited this whole movement in terms of statehood, or at least added more energy to the movement. So are you involved in that movement, or?
I've been to all the public meetings that the commission has had. I would thank the mayor and the commission for getting involved in the statehood movement and joining the citizens who've been out there in the trenches for decades now working on it. The one thing that is one of the big things that is missing, and where we have been pleading with the council and the mayor for a long time, is for them to adequately fund our effort for statehood. There really is hardly any funding, and when we authorized back in 1980 in passing the initiative, and when we approved the Constitution, we established a statehood delegation, congressional delegation, and that was the Tennessee plan that she's talking about now, to have a delegation that we paid and that we funded their expenses to represent us, to push our case in Congress. However, and I don't remember all the details of why it got postponed, but they were never elected until 1990. And they've never had any kind of salary. They've been basically paying out of their own pocket.
You mean the two senators
and our representative.
Right.
And if we're asking them to do what's effectively a nationwide campaign, there has to be resources. If we're going to make this current initiative have any effect at all, there has to be resources. And from what I've seen so far, no one's talking about any kind of funding for it, which makes you wonder, what are we going to be able to accomplish if you're just depending upon the same people to be the volunteers to make something happen? So we need the mayor and the council and the commission to really get behind, put their money where their mouth is, if we want to make this happen, because the people do want statehood.
And do you think that it may require the citizens of D.C. sort of lobbying, members of city council and even the mayor to fully fund this effort?
It will, but the problem is the other problem is the timeline. That everything is supposed to happen so quickly, which in any other circumstance would take months, if not, as to how much we're really going to be able to accomplish. The mayor's plan had sort of two sections: one to draft a new constitution or look at amending. We have 2 constitutions out there, to revise one. And the second one was the education component. Since we actually have a bill in front of Congress and we have a large number of co-sponsors, and the bill, that's what we need to push, and it provides that the Constitution will then be ratified after Congress passes the enabling legislation.
Wonderful.
So that if the effort was really focused on the education component, starting with the conventions and getting out into the districts and across the nation, that would be incredible, and we could actually maybe look forward to having the new Congress and the new president really make it happen. But it's going to need money.
Thank you for joining us today, Ann, and we certainly look forward to welcoming you back on the show so we can talk more in depth about all the wonderful work that you've been doing for Statehood. And thank you for joining us for this edition of the DC Statehood Today show. I'm Theodora Brown, your host. I'm Theodora Brown, and welcome to another edition of the DC Statehood Today show. We have in our studio today Janice Davis, who is a longtime political activist in DC. Welcome, Janice Davis.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thanks for coming today. So I want to focus a little bit about the work that you've been doing regarding statehood, and specifically the work that you're doing with the DC Democratic State Committee.
Okay. Well, I've been involved in statehood, I think, ever since I realized that we couldn't vote. I'm a 4th-generation DC person, and statehood was probably the most fundamental thing, and the reason that's my reason for being on the state committee.
Yeah, so what's your role on the state committee with respect to statehood?
Well, basically, I serve as one of the co-chairs, and in part because I've been very active in my other role as one of the board members and actually past president of the National Federation of Democratic Women. And we have pushed statehood in all of the many states that, this is, again, these are women's groups, and to me this is a very important role for me, because I get to go to the other states and tell them about our plight. On the state committee, what we try to do is basically get information, try to energize the committee, which doesn't need a whole lot of energy in terms
How large is your committee?
Our committee is about, well, actually, our committee is now a coalition, which is great because we have now formed a coalition to deal with all the other groups that are working on the whole issue of statehood. As you may recall, we had a lot of different messages about voting rights, budget autonomy, etc. But now the coalition has come together and work on statehood, because as many of your other guests, we've tried a lot of other things. We've tried voting rights. I was involved way back in the era of Fontroy when we wanted DC voting rights. But we have arrived at the same conclusion as has the mayor and everyone else, that statehood is the only way that we can truly become American citizens.
Now, I want to get back to your point about the mayor getting involved with statehood, but before that, let's talk a little bit more about the national work that you've done with the DC Federation, or the National Federation of Women.
Yeah, basically what we've done is year after year put in resolutions, again, on voting rights, on autonomy. I'd say for the last 10 years, because every time we offer a new resolution, they say, well, we'll amend it, because it has evolved. It became voting rights as a matter of civil rights, as a matter of women's rights, because there are more women in the city than there are men right now. And it has evolved into statehood, because at first we had a little bit of opposition. They said, you cannot be a state. But we were joined with our partners from, at that time, I think it was basically Alaska. We also had someone from Hawaii. And we worked very closely with the Puerto Rican delegation in their quest for statehood. So again, this was a basic human rights and a woman's rights issue. And what we've been able to do is to go to the different states and have this passed I think the most recent one was to get signers to our resolution, and the HR 317 to basically sponsor it. So we've been doing it in every state, and amazingly, many people still did not know that we were not. They said, well, you can vote. Yeah, we can vote for president, but they had no idea that we did not have voting representation. I think I guess in the year that I was sworn in as president, we did have and did honor our congresswoman for everything that she's done, and people still were amazed that this lady could no longer vote in committee and had no real vote in Congress.
So let's talk about the new and the reignited movement, if you will, that the mayor is involved with, the D.C. Statehood Commission. Tell me, what your involvement is in that work, and what your feelings are about that.
Well, I think probably when I think about the mayor, I think about her with us, basically standing up for our rights. And one of I guess what the protests, when actually at the time Mayor Gray was there, and she was jailed for that, and then how she stood out and worked with us at the Mint and everything. So I know statehood, especially as a native Washingtonian, is in her bones. And I think when she announced at our last Emancipation Day that she was going to start basically a referendum in order to get a new constitutional Congress in and to do a movement, because statehood has not happened. It's been she's been in office for a while, and she now has the power to do that. So she's gotten together the coalitions in order to try to pass this referendum and again bring it to the forefront for the nation as well as for the citizens.
And just to be clear, the work that the mayor is doing is actually part of the commission, the Statehood Commission.
Exactly.
And there are 5 members on the commission, which consists of the mayor, the chair of the city council, Mayor Bowser, Chairman Mendelson, Senators Brown and Strauss, and Representative Garcia. So they're actually a commission that votes to sort of spearhead this effort. So what's your involvement, and tell us what you...
Well, basically what we're involved in, and this is the state committee, because actually it was presented to everyone. Many of us have joined committees. I'm basically on the committee to do 2 things. One, to bring something forth for the convention that's happening, for the Democratic convention, unfortunately, not the Republican convention, and as well as one of the committees to bring it before the nation.
Okay, and so what committees have you joined, and tell us how you feel in 30 seconds or less.
In 30 seconds or less? Basically, in terms of the convention committee, because last year one of the biggest disappointments was that it did not get into the Democratic platform. So with the new emphasis from our for Senator Clinton, as well as from Senator, oh my gosh, Bernie, Senator Sanders, basically what we're going to be doing right now is we're pretty much guaranteed that'll come up into the convention. So that's going to be important, but we're also going to do some education, which is what we do every convention, and make sure that the other delegates know how important statehood is for the residents.
Well, that's great, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on the show today to tell us about all the wonderful work that the D.C. Democratic State Committee is doing for statehood.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you for future editions of D.C. Statehood Today.
Thank you for watching us. Remember, you can watch us online at dctv.org or dc51.us. You can also follow us on Twitter at dc51today. I'm Denisha Richard, and we hope to see you next time on DC Statehood Today.